Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a really interesting set of materials you sent over.
Yeah, there's a lot here. The main piece seems to be a discussion with Clif High from his Sci-Fi World channel, featured on Leak Project.
Exactly. And we're going to explore what that conversation covers, things like 5G tech, some persistent ideas about hybridization, and maybe some big environmental and societal shifts, all based on what's in that source material.
Right. Our goal here isn't to endorse any theories, but to really dig into the technical side of 5G as presented, look at the plausibility of some of the, well, let's call them conspiracy theories mentioned, and understand the bigger picture the source paints, just focusing on the info provided.
Absolutely. We want to give you, the listener, some solid context, help make sense of these complex, interconnected topics. Hopefully you'll have a few of those aha moments along the way.
So where do we start? 5G seems like the logical entry point.
Agreed. The source discussion kicks off by clarifying something pretty basic but important. 5G isn't one single frequency. It's the fifth generation of wireless tech from the telecom industry.
That's crucial. People often get bogged down thinking it's like one specific radio wave. It's not.
It's a generational leap.
Yeah. Think about 4G that uses lower frequency waves,
Yeah.
around 2.2 gigahertz or less, kind of like your Wi-Fi at home. Those are sort of standing pulse waves.
Okay, familiar territory. So how is 5G different?
Well, 5G moves into what are called millimeter bandwidths, wavelengths of a millimeter or less. These are very high frequency, high power waves.
Right, so higher frequency means more data. Is that the idea?
Exactly. Significantly more data can be carried simultaneously. It's like going from a garden hose with 4G to a massive fire hose with 5G.
A fire hose of data. And the source mentioned applications for that.
Yeah, things like smart glasses,
Mm.
devices that need constant high bandwidth connection to the internet to function,
Mm.
overlaying information onto your view in real time. That sort of thing becomes much more possible.
Okay, massive capacity. Sounds great. But there are downsides mentioned in the source, technical challenges.
Oh, definitely. Big ones. These millimeter waves, because they're so short, they don't penetrate obstacles very well at all.
Like what kind of obstacles?
Dense leaves on trees, brick walls, even your hand can potentially block the signal.
Really? So not great for getting a signal indoors or through, well, anything solid.
Not really. And another major issue is range. The signal degrades fast. The source mentioned an effective range of maybe only 500 feet.
500 feet, that's tiny compared to a normal cell tower.
It is. Very short range. It's like trying to shine a tightly focused flashlight beam through thick fog, powerful, but gets scattered and absorbed quickly.
So how on earth do you build a network with that kind of limitation?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? You need an incredibly dense network. Microtransmitters, receivers, repeaters.
Yeah.
Everywhere. On lamppost buildings, you name it.
Which sounds like a mind-bogglingly huge infrastructure investment.
Colossal. And this leads into some economic points raised in the source material.
Yeah, the speaker noted something interesting, didn't they? About the lack of hype compared to 4G.
Exactly. Remember the 4G rollout? Ads everywhere, maps showing expanded coverage, carriers fighting over who had the best network.
Right, it was a big push.
With 5G, the source points out, there was much less of that pre-launch buzz about coverage and consumer benefits, despite this enormous infrastructure cost. Where's the clear payback model for the telcos?
That is odd. Usually they're shouting from the rooftops about the next big thing and how it'll make them money.
Precisely. The relative quietness, according to the source, around the economic justification is noticeable. It makes you wonder, as the source implies later, if the main drivers aren't just faster downloads for consumers.
If maybe there are other motivations behind this massive, expensive rollout.
That's the question the source seems to pose.
Okay, so 5G, super high bandwidth, but tricky to deploy due to poor penetration in short range, needing this dense, expensive network with unclear economic drivers. Let's shift to the next layer. The source discussed potential weaponization and surveillance.
Right. This follows logically from the technical aspects and the cost questions. If it's not just about faster YouTube, what else could it be for?
And the source mentions some existing uses for these millimeter waves.
Yes. Apparently, in academic research, they're used in ways that function almost like a DNA microscope, non-invasive analysis at a molecular level.
DNA microscope. Wow,
Uh-huh.
okay. And military applications.
Also mentioned, things like crowd dispersal systems that heat the skin uncomfortably. The source even suggested potential for deeper tissue effects with prolonged exposure, though that seems more speculative.
And the connection to something more common? Airport scanners.
Yes, the TSA backscatter scanners, the ones that see through your clothes. They use the same 5G bandwidth, according to the source.
Okay, so the tech can see through things. How does that relate to surveillance in the source's view?
Well, that backscatter capability opens up possibilities. The source talks about using 5G for biometric ID.
Like fingerprinting or facial recognition?
Potentially more subtle. The source references Bob Lazar's claims from the 80s about a device that measured finger segment lengths for identification,
Hmm.
and speculates that 5G backscatter could, theoretically, be used to identify people by unique identifiers like bone structure, maybe even heartbeats, constantly and passively.
That's quite a claim. Continuous biometric scanning just by being near a 5G transmitter.
It's definitely out there, but it's what the source material discusses as a potential capability. Connect that to a ubiquitous 5G network linked to all our smart devices.
And you get potential recipe for unprecedented surveillance. Location, biometrics, habits, all potentially compiled.
That's the concern raised, yes. A vast interconnected data gathering system.
Okay, let's pivot now to the hybridization theories mentioned in the source. This is a topic we know pops up a lot in listener submissions.
It does. And the source connects it to 5G in a pretty unique way. But first, it grounds the idea in other references.
Like ancient texts.
Right. The Sumerian king list, Vedic texts, describing Vaimanas, these flying craft, and interactions with, well, non-human entities. Megalithic sites, too, like Pumapunku or Baalbek, are often brought up as evidence of tech beyond what conventional history accepts for those periods.
Stuff that makes you wonder, basically. And more recent things.
The source touches on the Wilson Davis memo leak, hinting at layers of secrecy around recovered technology, possibly non-human in origin.
Okay, so establishing a background of potential hidden history or non-human interaction. How does 5G fit into this, according to the source?
This is where it gets really speculative.
Hmm.
The idea presented is that 5G, with its millimeter waves and potential interaction with molecular structures, remember the DNA microscope idea, could theoretically be used to detect individuals with hybrid genetics.
Detect hybrids.
The theory, as presented in the source, seems to be that specific frequencies might interact differently with the electromagnetic fields around DNA, potentially revealing non-human genetic markers. Again, highly speculative.
Wow. Okay. So using 5G as a kind of genetic scanner on the population?
That's the provocative idea put forth in the material, yes.
And the source considered the implications of that, if it were possible.
It did. The immediate thought is the social impact. If you could identify a group as hybrid or other, well, history tells us that often leads to fear, division, maybe even persecution.
A potentially massive social disruption based on identifying people at a genetic level.
Exactly. The source flags that as a serious potential consequence if such a scenario were ever to play out.
All right, let's move on to another major theme in the source. Environmental and social shifts. This part felt quite dramatic.
It did. There's discussion about the shift in language from global warming to climate change, but then the source suggests something counterintuitive, an impending ice age.
Which sounds bizarre given current heat waves, right?
It does on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
But the perspective offered in the source is that these extreme heat events might be part of the oscillation before a larger cooling trend kicks in, like the calm before the storm, or maybe the fever before the chill sets in a climatic sense, part of a cycle leading potentially to glaciation.
And they cited specific events as possible evidence.
Yeah, freak weather like that massive hailstorm in Guadalajara, Mexico a few years back, reports of several feet of ice in June, and record snowpack in places like Colorado recently, signs of rapid extreme shifts.
Not just gradual warming. And historical parallels were drawn.
Yes, the source mentions the Dark Ages in Europe, linking it to a period of a dimmer sun, crop failures, social breakdown. The idea being similar pressures could arise again, maybe on a global scale this time.
Which ties into the social order aspect. The source mentions society kind of fracturing.
It did, yeah.
Okay.
And pointed a finger partly at social media algorithms maybe amplifying emotional responses, driving wedges between people.
Making society less resilient just when it might need to be most cohesive.
That seems to be the implication. And within that context, the source also talks about the narrative around UFOs, or potential alien disclosure.
Suggesting it might be managed, controlled.
Yeah, the idea that any disclosure might be carefully orchestrated, maybe to maintain social order or control during turbulent times, rather than just a sudden reveal of everything.
Interesting angle. The source also cast doubt on one specific conspiracy theory, though. The sealed indictments one.
It did, yes, primarily on logistical grounds. The sheer number often claimed hundreds of thousands would be practically impossible to prosecute through the existing legal system. The resources required would be immense.
Just wouldn't work on a practical level.
That was the assessment presented in the source material. Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap up by touching on some of the specific claims and counterarguments that floated through the source discussion. It wasn't all just one viewpoint.
No, definitely not. For instance, the idea was floated that maybe Russia has an interest in promoting the narrative that 5G is dangerous.
Ah, the geopolitical angle. Disinformation campaigns.
Potentially. It highlights how complex attributing motives can be. The source also noted that widespread negative discussion about 5G in mainstream circles seems slow to emerge compared to the enthusiast tech press.
Which adds to that feeling of something being off, perhaps?
It contributes to the questioning, yes, as does the point about potential military or surveillance applications being a primary driver, rather than just consumer benefits.
And there was an anecdote about seeing 5G equipment installed, but not turned on.
Yeah, anecdotal evidence, but observations like that feed into the narrative that maybe the rollout isn't purely for the reasons stated publicly. It connects back to the high cost and the fuzzy revenue streams for a full Internet of Things powered by 5G.
Makes sense. The source also had a good reminder about personal perception, didn't it?
Yes, basically saying that if you suddenly become very interested in, say, UFOs or hybridization, you might start seeing information about it everywhere. That doesn't necessarily mean there's objectively more information, just that your awareness, your filter is changed.
Confirmation bias, essentially, seeing what you're looking for.
Exactly. A healthy dose of self-awareness is needed when exploring these topics. The source also advised caution regarding literal interpretations of ancient texts, while still valuing them historically.
Don't necessarily believe in flying chariots verbatim, but don't dismiss the texts entirely either.
Something like that. Find the nuance. And finally, there was that interesting tidbit about elongated skulls in European royal portraits.
Right, the idea that this information was maybe suppressed and is now resurfacing.
Yeah, presented as another piece suggesting that our commonly accepted history might have gaps or managed narratives. It just adds another layer to the overall puzzle presented to the source.
Okay, so pulling all this together from our deep dive into the source material, 5G emerges as this really powerful but technically challenging tech. Its rollout is expensive, the economics a bit murky according to the source, and it carries potential surveillance capabilities far beyond just faster streaming. Then you have these persistent hybridization theories, drawing on ancient mysteries, modern leaks, and speculatively linked by the source to 5G's potential detection capabilities, all with potentially huge social consequences.
And layered on top of that, the source points to potentially dramatic environmental shifts, maybe not what we expect, and signs of social fracturing, raising questions about control and disclosure narratives.
It's a complex tapestry of technology, conspiracy, environmental concern, and social commentary, all woven together in the source material we examined.
Which really leaves a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given all these interconnected pieces, the power and questions around 5G, the possibility, however speculative, of non-human factors, the real environmental and social changes happening, what assumptions are you making about where things are headed? And more importantly, perhaps, what information out there might challenge those assumptions? In this flood of information we all live in, how do you personally navigate the line between credible insights, informed speculation presented in sources like the one we discussed, and, well, pure fantasy? What's your responsibility in figuring that out?